king determined to recover the relics of Jesus. Obsessed with the idea of justice preached by Jesus of Nazareth. Considered a saint even during his lifetime, even though he had a certain degree of cruelty. One of the fastest canonizations in the history of the church. So do you already know which king I'm talking about? Or should I say which saint? Well, let me give you a hint. Is he the one represented in this sculpture at the top of this church here in France? And if you look closely, he's carrying Jesus' crown of thorns. I'm here in Fontainebleau, 60 kilometers from Paris in France, to tell the story of King Louis IX, also known as Saint Louis. He became king at the age of 12 during the Middle Ages in the year 1226. He ruled France for more than 40 years. He made historic changes in the kingdom, changes that left a mark on the world. But nothing cost him as much effort as bringing Jesus' crown of thorns here. During his Christian reign, King Louis IX led the Seventh Crusade, wanting to retake the Holy Land from the Muslims. And he also personally went to Jerusalem to negotiate the purchase of relics, especially Jesus' crown of thorns. It was a very difficult negotiation with Emperor Baldwin II. 2 years of back and forth. Louis IX wanted to be seen as the greatest monarch in the Catholic world, and for that he spent half of all the money his kingdom collected in a year. He bought 22 relics. Among them, some fragments of the Holy Cross of Jesus. But, well, other European kings also had fragments of the cross. What only Louis IX managed to get, something very rare, was what Emperor Baldwin claimed to be the true crown of thorns of Jesus Christ. It was then that Pilate took Jesus and ordered him to be flogged. And the soldiers, having woven a crown of thorns, placed it on his head and put a purple robe around him. They came up to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and they slapped him. The description that appears in chapter 19 of the Gospel of John shows that the crowning of Jesus was, above all, a session of mockery. The Romans had no mercy at all for the Nazarene. On the contrary, and to think that Pilate washed his hands? Well, he may have washed his hands, but they're still dirty. Pilate ordered them to hurt Jesus as much as he could. He mocked him with the inscription, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," written in 3 languages at the top of the cross. And he even ordered a crown to be placed on him so that he would be ridiculed and tortured at the same time. Hail Mary! It's curious that a king who was just in almost everything he did wanted to have here in his kingdom the instrument of torture used by the Romans to hurt Jesus. But we know that Louis IX wanted to have a first-class relic, something that is very sacred to every Christian, something that was in contact with the body of Jesus Christ. In this case, more specifically, with the sacred blood of Jesus on the day of his crucifixion. But at the same time, we can understand it as a symbolic act because Louis IX would drastically reduce the torture that still happened here in France very frequently. And in reality, in possession of the instrument of torture used by the Romans to kill Jesus, maybe the king also wanted to say, "Enough with the torture." Louis, also known as the Mediator, ruled France for more than 40 years and made ruling his kingdom almost a religious act. From the very first day, he was inspired by the values of Christianity, believing that spiritual and political powers could be embodied by a single man. And by looking at the world as a Christian, Louis IX also sought to be the just king, in the broadest sense of the word justice. And then, in the heart of the Middle Ages, a time of great cruelty, when the nobles had rights to everything and the common people were left with almost nothing, King Louis decided to soften the excesses committed by the feudal regime in the name of the common good, which also meant being a judge. And thus he transformed France into a modern monarchy, no longer based only on the personal relationships between the king and his subjects, turning the king into a head of state who dealt with the affairs of the kingdom in a sensible way. King Louis IX had a very keen sense of justice and made major changes in the French courts. He even implemented legal concepts that last to this day. He created a 40-day waiting period to prevent wars. That is, any conflict between two villages or two families, whatever it was, had to wait 40 days before it could be discussed. It was a way to force the people involved in the dispute to think things over and, who knows, maybe find peaceful and fair ways to resolve those conflicts. Still in the 13th century, Louis IX determined that anyone accused of a crime should, above all, be considered innocent. This concept would lead to another one, also used to this day, the idea that the burden of proof lies with the accuser. To give you an idea of how innovative this was, it was only in 1948 that the presumption of innocence became a fundamental human right, recognized by the countries that make up the United Nations. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is still valid today, Article 11 states, "Anyone accused of a criminal act is presumed innocent until their guilt is legally established. In a public trial where all the necessary guarantees for their defense have been assured." Louis IX also decided to prohibit a legal practice that existed until then, absurdly known as the judgment of God. A religious process in which the defendants were subjected to a test, also called ordeal, a painful and often deadly trial during which it was decided whether God considered that person innocent or guilty. That's right. If someone passed the test, it was because God wanted that person to be set free. And if they didn't pass, well, then it was a terrible condemnation. It was from these judgments of God, which had nothing divine about them, that the expression trial by fire originated. You're getting it already, right? In trials by fire, the defendant was placed in the fire so that the judges could determine whether he was guilty or innocent. But of course, the most common outcome was that no one survived the damn trial. King Louis IX put an end to the trials by fire, and there was still another ordeal that gave rise to the expression, to put your hand in the fire. Now that you know the story, would you put your hand in the fire for someone? In the ordeal of the red-hot iron, the defendant had to carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 steps. After that, the hand was wrapped in a leather pouch sealed by the judge. To determine if the accused was guilty or innocent, they would examine the wound. So what then? If the person who had put their hand on the red-hot iron ended up with a wound? If the wound looked good, she was innocent. If it looked bad, she was guilty. When we say we'd put our hand in the fire for someone, it's because we trust that person, right? Well, King Louis IX didn't want any of that. He ordered an end to all kinds of ordeals. Despite his great concern for justice today, with the privilege that historical distance gives us. Looking at the reign of Louis IX, it's impossible to turn a blind eye to the injustices he committed. And almost all of them were against the Jews. At that time, there was a lot of resentment among Christians because of the accusation that it was the Jews who had Jesus killed. And I've always seen an inconsistency in that. I ask myself, but Jesus, the apostles, the disciples, all of them, those who followed Jesus, weren't they all Jews? But the reality is that the hatred persisted, and more than a millennium later, King Louis IX ordered the persecution of the Jews here in France. One of the most terrible decisions of Louis IX was the order that Jews be forcibly converted to Christianity. And to achieve this, he took several measures. Among them, he ordered the burning of the Talmud, the book of rabbinical notes, so important in Jewish tradition. And he forced the Jews to wear a ruelle, or a small circular piece of fabric that was sewn onto their clothes so they could be recognized and discriminated against in the streets of France. Unfortunately, it's a similar practice that was used centuries later by the Nazis, when they forced the Jews to wear stars of David sewn onto their clothes, when they spray painted the shops, when they destroyed everything, when they wanted to mark the Jews so they would be discriminated against. It's absurd prejudice, which today would even lead many people to question the holiness of King Louis. But those were different times. And it's undeniable that a central issue in the life of King Louis IX was the events that marked the last days of Jesus. It's no coincidence, faced with the difficulties that Christians were facing there in the Holy Land, he felt called, decided to lead more than 30,000 knights and leave France to go to the Holy Land, to reconquer the territories that once belonged to the Christians, to go to the land, to the Christian territories that were known for the story of Jesus. And then King Louis led the Hospitaller Knights, the Templar Knights, his army, and was accompanied by other kings with their knights from Europe, and went to Jerusalem to carry out the Seventh Crusade. The crusade under the leadership of Louis IX began in Egypt and came very close to conquering Cairo, but a flood of the Nile River disrupted their plans. The Muslims took the Crusaders' supplies and they faced hunger and serious diseases. Louis IX decided to retreat, was captured, and was only able to be freed after paying 800,000 pieces of gold. He finally arrived in the Holy Land and stayed there for 4 years. During this time, he negotiated buying the crown of thorns and other relics of Jesus. He returned in 1254 after recovering prisoners, but without reconquering Jerusalem, which was still under Muslim control. After recovering from a serious illness here in France, King Louis IX regained his strength and decided to set out on a mission once again. He set out on the 8th Crusade. He just didn't know that he would never return here to France. This painting, which is prominently displayed here in the Church of St. Louis in Fontainebleau, it shows the king's death. It's interesting to notice that he's not in France, nor in any of the castles where you would expect a king's death to happen. King Louis is on his deathbed in Tunisia, where he actually died during the 8th Crusade. We can see around him many knights, including the Crusaders who accompanied him, of course, as well as Hospitallers and Templars witnessing the king's death. And it's interesting to see that he is surrounded by loved ones. But the setting is clearly a battlefield, the king dead in a military camp. We see in the background a person, a religious figure who looks like a bishop, or maybe even the Pope. And all the knights around mourning the death of King Louis IX, who they didn't know yet, but very soon, would become a saint. Over all these years, many theories have emerged about the cause of King Louis IX's death. They thought he might have died of bubonic plague, maybe dysentery, or even typhus, diseases that were common at that time. Only recently, in 2019, they decided to run laboratory tests on the king's remains. And then they concluded that he died of scurvy, one of the most frequent diseases on the battlefields of that time. The scurvy that killed King Louis IX comes from a lack of vitamin C, which causes serious problems in the gums, makes it difficult for wounds to heal, and can lead to death by hemorrhage. Many other works of art have portrayed the death of the king who became a saint, and in all of them we see deep emotion. When I started studying the history of King Louis IX, I immediately asked myself the question, is the capital of Marañón named in his honor? It was close, or rather off by a few centuries, that our beautiful capital of Marañón was named Saint Louis after King Louis XIII of France. When it was founded in 1612, Saint Louis do Maranhão was a part of Brazil under French rule, and the king at the time was a distant successor of Louis IX. Even when it was handed over to the Portuguese 3 years after its founding, Saint Louis do Maranhão did not change its name. But there are many cities dedicated to the Holy King around the world. One of them is St. Louis in the United States. The city's cathedral, which is in the American state of Missouri, was consecrated almost 100 years ago and elevated to the status of basilica by Pope John Paul II. Throughout Europe, there are more than 70 churches dedicated to St. Louis. Most of them are in France, of course. And one of them, the one here in Fontainebleau, has the unusual distinction of having been built right in front of one of the largest castles in the country. Well, I say country today, but at the time it was the Kingdom of France. This painting, made by Pierre Denis Martin just a few decades after the church was built, shows what it looked like to King Louis the Fiend from his castle in Fontainebleau when he came here to spend the winter and hunt wild boars. The king who became a saint dedicated a large part of his life to religion and had many churches built. One of them, for many people, is one of the most beautiful in the world. The Sainte-Chapelle was built in a very noble area of Paris, precisely to house the relics of Christ's Passion, the fragments of the Holy Cross and Jesus' crown of thorns, which was later transferred to Notre-Dame de Paris. The great work, commissioned by St. Louis, has 1,113 stained glass windows with scenes from the Old and New Testaments. Some are 15 meters tall. And among this marvel of stained glass art, we see images of the king who built it. As soon as Louis IX died, he was already regarded as a saint. Still on the battlefield there in Tunisia, his brother Charles the Ferdinand decided to keep his entrails and his heart. And he transported these relics to a church in the Palermo region in what is now Italy. His bones were brought in a procession, crossed Italy, went up the Alps, came down, and arrived in France. And then they were taken to the royal necropolis of the Cathedral of Saint Denis, where they remain to this day. Some bones, however, were scattered among the churches of France, and soon after, the death of King Louis IX sparked veneration.